Yeah, I mean, as I kind of said before we started recording, I'd like to kind of go through your career and then kind of use that to learn about memory and the hippocampus and all these kind of things. And I thought we could maybe start with something I read in a profile on you, I think in PNAS, which was that your father was an industrial chemist and then you studied chemistry at university and then very quickly no longer studied chemistry at university. I was just curious, was it as obvious the motivation for you to start studying chemistry as it sounds, that your dad did it and then you thought, okay, I'll do it? Or what was the motivation to study chemistry and then to no longer study chemistry?
I think it was more that it was what my father had done. I didn't really have a particular thing I wanted to do. So the university I chose to go to, McGill, where I went, and the places I applied to were all good in chemistry. Those were the places I chose to apply to. And so I went to McGill because it had a good chemistry department. In fact, Rutherford, had a Nobel Prize winner, had been at McGill. So it was in chemistry. So it was a good choice for somebody interested in chemistry. But I wasn't like devoted to chemistry. I wasn't a kid playing with chemistry sets or anything like that. I didn't have a big focus on it. And it became, once I got to McGill and I enrolled in my first chemistry class and I took my first chemistry lab, serious chemistry lab. I had done some chemistry lab work at high school. I'd gone to Stuyvesant High School, which is sort of a special high school, a test in high school in New York City where, a lot of the more academically oriented kids in the city go to either Stuyvesant or Bronx High School of Science. I went to Stuyvesant, did some chemistry, got to McGill, went into the chemistry lab, and within 2 or 3 sessions in the lab, it was pretty clear that I was not cut out to be a chemist, at least not if I had to lab work. I was probably going to be dangerous to others and myself if I persisted in that. So that was really within the first semester. It was clear that chemistry was probably not my future. So I started looking around for something else that might be interesting, and I enrolled in an introductory to psychology class because why not? And just so happened that class was taught by D.O. Hebb, who was at McGill and was very famous. I didn't know that when I enrolled in the class, and I took this class with Hebb, and that was it, basically. Now, in retrospect, I remembered back when I spoke to my mother about it many years later. She said, "Well, when you were young, you had expressed an interest in why what goes wrong with people when they have mental disorders and things like that. You had expressed an interest in figuring out what goes on in people's brains when things go wrong. It was something you talked about when you were younger, but not something you obsessed about, but you mentioned it. So apparently I had some interest in these things, and it got completely kindled by taking the course with Hebb, and that was it. I mean, once I took that course, it was clear this is what I wanted to. This is what I was really interested in doing, but I wasn't sure whether I should be, approaching it as a doctor or as a researcher. Mm-hmm. I wasn't aware, of course, you could be both at that point in time. You could either. So I was really shifted into a pre-med track, although I was majoring in psychology. I was taking a lot of psychology classes, but I was pre-med, more or less. And then I didn't get into medical school because I was, shall we say, not a perfect student for the first few years I was at university. So my grades weren't good enough. I was quite good in my 3rd and 4th years, but my grades weren't good enough. I didn't get into medical school, but I was in Montreal. And by that point, I was married, and I think I may have even had a kid on the way. And
you're not sure?
Well, I'm trying to place the years. My first kid was born in 1964, and I was not. Yeah, that was the year I was in between. So having not gone into medical school and being quite connected to folks in psychology because I had taken a lot of classes, I got a job in a lab working for one of the professors. I got a job as a tech, as an RA, in Dalbia Bindra's lab. Bindra was a full professor interested in motivation. Most of his work had been on humans, but he got interested in animals, and he was doing some work with animals looking at the effects of various drugs on spontaneous behavior by animals. So I spent a year, my year off, so to speak, my gap year, my involuntary gap year, working in the lab, basically injecting rats with various drugs, including LSD at that time, which was freely available. And for this was before it became popular, and it was just at that time it was beginning to sort of be usable as a psychedelic, but researchers could still have access to it. So Bindra had bunches of LSD sitting around in drawers, pure Sandoz LSD, little did I know, probably worth millions of dollars. But anyway, and I was injecting rats and looking at their behavior, and then I applied to get into graduate school at McGill. And McGill had a policy of never letting its own students who did a degree undergrad to do grad work. It was like there had been one exception in 50 years or something like that. But I guess I got on well with Bindra, so he kind of convinced folks there to let me get into the graduate program, because I hadn't really been, a psychologist as an undergrad. Anyway, well, for whatever reason, they took me into graduate school, and that's how I got started. And I started out as a teaching assistant in Hebb's introductory class, the one that I had taken, as an undergrad myself. So then I got to interact with Hebb and so on. Now at McGill, as a graduate student, my interest immediately zeroed in on memory, because, Hebb and cell assemblies, and of course the patient HM had been, studied in Montreal a lot. I mean, the Montreal Neurological Institute was where the work on the patient HM was done. Even though the surgery was done in Hartford, Connecticut, they didn't have the neuropsychologists to look into HM. So Scoville, everyone knows this, by the way. I'd be talking to people who know this. Scoville contacted Penfield at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and Penfield contacted Hebb and said, I've got this interesting patient. Somebody said they want to look at, you got somebody who wants to look at it. And Brenda Milner was Hebb's graduate student at that point. Yeah. And that's how Brenda Milner got onto HM. Now, here's a crazy coincidence. Brenda Milner very quickly was working with HM from the 50s, late 50s on into the 60s. I was a graduate student, and I was at McGill in the early 60s. And as a second year undergraduate, this would have been 1961, I roomed with two people, one of whom was named Bud Corkin, who married Suzanne Corkin, who was working with HM. So I found out about HM or heard about HM indirectly as an undergraduate without ever thinking it would mean anything to me, basically. So I become a graduate student. I'm interested in memory. And that's how I got going on the projects I got going on. One looking at memory and cortex using cortical spreading depression as a technique, which had been brought into the field, so to speak, by Jan Bureš, who worked in Prague at the Czech Academy of Sciences. So I used that technique in my master's thesis to study the role of the cortex in kind of learning. And then I shifted to hippocampus after that for my PhD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can I ask briefly about Hebb, kind of what it was like? I mean, you really mentioned that his introductory course seemed to have had quite the effect on you. And then was he head of department at McGill at the time?
He was the head of department. Sorry. Yes, he was the head of department by that point. At that time, I didn't understand how crazy it was to try to be the head of a department and also, run a research lab. I found out about that later. He was head of the department. All the people who worked with animals were in one building, closer to the medical school complex. The people who were in psychology who worked with humans were in another building. We weren't together at that point. That happened a few years later. They built a new building. We all came together. So at that point, Hebb was over here and the animal researchers were over here, basically like 15 minutes away, walking or something. So we didn't see a lot of each other. During the years when I was a graduate student, I saw Hebb enough because I was teaching. I was a TA in his class, and because I took some seminars with him. But one didn't see him a lot because we were in a different building. The animal folks were, and who did we hang out with there? It was more Peter Milner, who was, of course, quite famous for his co-discovery with Olds of brain self-stimulation. That's Olds and Milner in 1954. The first kind of paper showing brain self-stimulation reward, that was Peter Milner, who, of course, at that point was married to Brenda Milner. Small world, right? And also in that group was Ron Melzack. Ron Melzack was the Melzack of Melzack and Wall, the gate control theory of pain. And Melzack had recently come to the department, and one of his first graduate students was John O'Keefe. Okay, so all of these pieces came together. Now, we were all kind of in different places. I interacted with Hebb maybe more than some of the other students because I kind of took him on or he took me on one way or the other as a mentor. My actual advisor, Dalbia Bindra, who was a fabulous person, really a wonderful person, died way too young, by the way. He didn't know much about animal research because he was a human researcher. So I actually got most of my feedback, mentoring about animal research, either from my fellow students or from Milner or Melzack or Hebb, who knew a lot more about animal stuff than Bindra did. So it was a funny time. But I did have a fair amount to do with Hebb, given those constraints. He was a fascinating man. He was a kind of in many ways, a dour Scots kind of person. That's his background. He was born in Nova Scotia, and he went back to Nova Scotia when he retired. He was a kind of a feet planted firmly on the ground, no nonsense kind of person, no pretension, gruff, hard on his students. He was a tough taskmaster, but he was as they say, he was a teddy bear inside. I mean, he when his students got into trouble, he was the first one to help them. And of course, this was the 60s. So many of my fellow graduate students, shall we say, got into trouble. It was a period of much experimentation, shall we say. And Hebb was quite helpful when, but his attitude was basically he threw his students into the water, and if they figured out how to swim, so to speak, then they could survive. If they couldn't figure out how to swim, that is, how to do research that mattered, how to be a good graduate student, blah, blah. If they couldn't figure it out, without too much input from him, by the way, then he would throw them a life raft and tell them they should probably think about a different career. So, he was firm, but also at critical moments quite supportive. I liked him a lot. I had a lot to do with him. And later on, perhaps we get to it, when I was in London, he did a sabbatical at University College London in the psychology department when I was in anatomy. So we interacted at that point in time in 1974, it was 74, 75. And then when he retired back to Halifax, he would come into the psychology department at Dalhousie University, which is the university in Halifax, quite a good university, by the way, with a very strong psychology department. He would come in once a week to that department. As it just so happens, I spent 2 years in that department from 77 to 79. We can get to that later if it's worth talking about. So I had another 2 years of interaction with Hebb at that point. And I also sort of tentatively got caught up in perhaps joining him in co-editing the last edition of his introductory textbook, the one that I had taken as a first or second year undergraduate. But that didn't pan out. I didn't. That was my bad. I did not handle that properly. I was not prepared to do that. I semi-committed to it and then really didn't do it. So I was a bit of a disappointment to Hebb in the end, I think. But we had a good relationship, and he was a fascinating and incredibly smart guy. I mean, just his first year graduate seminar was kind of famous. Hebb's seminar was the famous seminar that all the first year graduate students had to take. And he would be sitting at one end of a long oak table in the medical school library, blowing smoke rings from the pipe that he was always smoking, and asking very tough questions of all the graduate students. A lot of them about philosophy, by the way. Come back to the philosophy point later. And if you didn't get it right, he was pretty harsh. But if you engaged him and actually got into a debate with him and you were winning the debate, he'd switch the subject, and he ran the whole show. So he was really a good object lesson in many ways. And then when I got into the position where I was teaching graduate students, I created a Hebb seminar just like his. I mean, I created a first-year seminar for all the first-year students to take, just like I took, so to speak, and tried to emulate, what he did with the first-year graduate students. Badly, I suspect, but anyway, tried. Yeah. So that Hebb was a formative person in my experience. Absolutely certain. Clearly, an incredibly important person in the field.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds also like when I listen to just some of the people you mentioned from that time at that place, it seems like you randomly went to McGill because of chemistry, and then you're like, well, that didn't work out, and then you happen to like just fall into like one of the most influential like decades, or well, not decades necessarily, but like the people you just mentioned. It's just crazy. Like, I mean, I guess many of them only became famous in after time. I assume John O'Keefe was probably just, I don't know, maybe you can tell me more about that later, but I'm assuming he was just one of the graduate students there. I don't know, maybe he was already a standout then, but yeah, I'm just curious, like, were you at all aware of like what was going on at the time then, who you were interacting with, and how, I mean, I don't like the word influence necessarily, but just like how cool the things were that people were finding out there at the time, or was that just blew straight over your head?
Well, I think we understood how cool the things were that people were working on. I certainly didn't understand how unique the setting was. And you got it exactly right. I mean, and I have mentioned this at many points. I've been unbelievably lucky, basically. I mean, this was pure luck to have been in that place and then find myself in that environment, surrounded by that group of people. And as you say, I could have been anywhere. I didn't go there for that purpose. I mean, that was incredibly lucky, and the environment was fabulous. I mean, John was one of a handful of the graduate students in the cohort. He started a year before me. He started the year I was doing my gap year, when I was doing research in the department. So I was already integrated. Everybody assumed I was a graduate student, even though I wasn't even in the program yet. I was being treated as a kind of a graduate student because I knew all of them, and we were all interacting together. And so I met John right away when he first showed up. And he was one of a handful of incredibly smart students who were in the department. He certainly is the one who was, who ended up achieving, at obviously a crazy level. But there were others at the time who we thought were better. I mean, if at that point in time we had said, who are the few who are going to make the biggest mark? I mean, John might have been in that category. I might have been in that category, but there were a few others who were, who everybody agreed they were the top, right? And some of them did. I mean, neither of the two that we all thought were the best actually had a significant career in the end for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into. But there were other. Graham Goddard was a year or two ahead of us. Now, you may not know that name, Graham Goddard, but he was maybe the most important figure in the study of the amygdala in the 1960s. His dissertation was on the amygdala. He's the one who discovered kindling in the amygdala, kind of the effect of stimulation leading to the emergence of seizures in the amygdala, called the kindling effect. Graham was an incredible, impactful, important person. He went on to create really strong departments at Waterloo. He first went to Waterloo in Ontario and created a strong department. He then went to Dalhousie, which is in Halifax, which is why I ended up there. We can get to that later about how that happened. And then he went to Dunedin in New Zealand to sort of create the department in Otago University that then became a very strong department in hippocampal research and amygdala research because Graham. So he was a serial creator of strong brain behavior psychology departments. He got killed in a hiking accident very young in New Zealand.
Sorry, was that who Kate Jeffrey talked about?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Kate Jeffrey would have referred to.
So for those who don't know, I interviewed Kate Jeffrey, one of my first episodes, and she mentioned how her master's and I think potential PhD, I can't remember exactly but her master's supervisor died in this hiking accident. And she was very close, actually also hiking with friends at the time or something like that. It's a crazy story that she tells in the beginning. Okay. So
that's the person. And Graham was a very close friend, for many of years to me. He spent some time in London when John and I were writing the book, and he gave us in the early 70s. He gave us incredibly good feedback on early drafts of the book. So Graham was just somebody who played a really so. The atmosphere in the department when I was a graduate student, I didn't understand how unique it was. To answer your question, I had no idea, the privilege and that I was being extended by that. Not just the people who were there, but the visitors who came. I mean, all the biggest names in the field, of course, wanted to visit with Hebb. So we got to see the most famous people in the field came through McGill. They gave talks. We met them. We interacted with them. I mean, we, as graduate students, we were just living in this rarefied world of the top echelon of what has become cognitive neuroscience. We had no idea. And as somebody who went to undergrad at McGill, I also had no idea that most people who were being trained in psychology in North America were having their heads full of nonsense about behaviorism and stuff like that, and how unimportant the brain was for psychologists and blah, blah, blah. I was in Montreal listening to Hebb say, if you're going to be a psychologist, you have to study both physiology and psychology. You have to put the brain in the behavior. I never imagined that there was a whole field full of psychologists who didn't think it was important to study the brain. So again, the privilege of being, in a place where that was clearly understood right away, right? Whereas most of the people being trained in the 60s in most places in the US were getting a rather different picture, of how to approach, what has become kind of cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience in general. Enormously privileged and lucky, and had no idea how lucky I was.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't maybe quite been in such a place, but I did, do 1 year of my master's at UCL. And it was this weird thing where, because I did my undergraduate at Goldsmiths, which is also in London, but it's a much smaller place. And, there, whenever someone vaguely famous would come along, you'd be really excited and watch their talk or whatever. And at UCL, it's just, you just get completely bored by like the biggest names in neuroscience coming and giving a talk, because like, oh, well, tomorrow there's the same, like someone as big doing. Yeah, it was funny to me, like how quickly I got used to it, how fun it was, like, oh yeah, now I have a lecture by Wolfram Schulz and next week is by Peter Dayan or whatever, just like you just kind of get used to this. But yeah, it definitely sounds like that time at McGill was a pretty special time.
It was a very special time. And sadly, the department sort of went into decline after that, or apparent decline. I don't want to diss my colleagues.
Yeah.
I think they would agree that, that era was a golden era. The 50s and the 60s at McGill was a golden era. And maybe it would be impossible to recreate, what was the case during those years. I
was about to say, I think everything that's a golden era will at some point no longer be a golden era. I wanted to ask then, I mean, so you already mentioned you did a postdoc in Prague, or you started a postdoc in Prague. I guess we'll get to exactly what happened there then. But yeah, so you mentioned that you already used the technique of the person who was in Prague, which I guess also answered my question, which is, why did you go to Prague? Because I guess I have to be slightly careful because I have listeners from the Czech Republic, but I checked. But it's pretty unusual, I guess, for people from the US, Canada, Western Europe or something to go to Eastern Europe in general, right? To do research. Yeah, maybe can you elaborate a bit more on like, also, I guess, like for you, what the decision was, or how you made the decision to go there, and then maybe what then happened when you were in Prague and why you had to leave.
Well, one of the two people in the graduate program that I said we all thought was going to be the real success, who didn't, was a friend called Philip Liss, not a name you will have heard of. He was brilliant. He ended up schizophrenic, and the ending is sad. At this point, he was a graduate student. He was a sort of quirky, brilliant graduate student, and he took advantage of the fact that a very famous Polish neuropsychologist named Jerzy Konarski. You've heard the name Konarski? If you haven't, you should have. Okay. Go look him up. He was one of Pavlov. He came out of the Pavlovian tradition. Konorsky was a very famous physiologically oriented psychologist, wrote a very important book that came out in 1967. Anyway, Konorsky came through our lab to visit in 1965. Short guy. I'm short, but he was short guy. Dynamo, incredible energy, amazing guy, fascinating. Came and talked with all the students and did like a chalk talk, and we had incredible. Anyway, Phil decided, I want to go work with this guy. So Phil got a postdoc fellowship from NIH to go work in Warsaw at the Nensky Institute for Biological whatever. Nensky is still a very famous institute. Konorsky was at the Nensky. Phil went there. And he wrote me and said, this is fabulous. This is a great thing. It's really interesting, blah, blah, blah. So that sort of opened the door to the idea of going to Eastern Europe. At that point in time, NIH was still giving out a very small number, but giving out postdoctoral fellowships to people to go outside the USA. There were a handful. So both John and I applied for such fellowships. John applied for one to go to London to work with Pat Wall, the other half of the Melzack-Wall pain thing, because John was interested in dorsal columns at that time and pain stuff. And I applied to go work with Buresh. And we both got these NIH postdocs. And so I was open to going to Eastern Europe because of Phil. But also, at that point in time, this is the 1960s, 66, 67, a lot of political stuff going on. I was also interested in going and living in what was a socialist country. I mean, I was naive enough to think, that there was some reason to be interested in such places. I didn't know enough yet. I soon learned, as history taught me something about socialism. Anyway, that was part of it. Part of it was political and personal. I had actually sent letters for possible postdocs to 3 different labs. One of them in California, where I heard back, but I didn't like the response, so I didn't pursue it. One of them in Mexico, somebody called Raul Hernandez Peon had a lab in Mexico. He was one of the co-discoverers of reticular activating stuff. He was very, very in the early work on arousal systems. If you go back to the 60s, you'll find his name. So I applied to him as well. Unfortunately, he got killed in a car accident, even before I even heard back from him. So I didn't like the guy in California for reasons I can go into later. Yeah, doesn't matter. And his response was weird. And Buresh said, "Sure, if you get money, come." So that was it. I got money and I went. Basically, I had never been west of the Mississippi. I grew up in New York, went to school in Montreal. Had never been west of the Mississippi River, and I got on a plane with my then wife and 2 little kids and went to Prague. My project that got me the money was I was going to use techniques that Buresh had developed for recording from single cells to try to do conditioning in individual neurons. I was going to stimulate individual neurons in the hippocampus or cortex. I was also going to stimulate or record in the hypothalamus to add reward in. I was going to try to do conditioning at the neuronal single cell level. It was a great idea, but it was crazy. There's no way I was ever going to be able to do that, by the way. I was way, way beyond my skills or in fact, what I found out when I got to the lab in Prague, it was way beyond the capacity of the lab to support technically that actual kind of experiment. I mean, they had handmade computers, basically, and they worked, and you could do stuff. But anyway, we quickly gave that up. And I ended up going back to spreading depression and doing a whole bunch of very interesting experiments, mostly with Olga Burashova, who was his wife and partner in the lab. So Buresh and Burashova were a academic couple. He was the famous one. She was the one who did a lot of the work in the lab. They both were famous. And I worked with her. She's a fabulous person. They're both dead now. They became my ideal of what it meant to be an academic couple. How you could both be scientists and make it work personally, professionally, for the lab. Turns out not to be, there've been some famous academic couples, especially in the hippocampal world.
Yeah.
I mentioned already Milner and Milner, all right? And now the Mosers, right? Barnes and McNaughton, right? I mean, these are Carol Barnes and Bruce McNaughton were a couple for 30 years. So there have been some famous couples in this world. Very few of them made their personal thing work out, by the way. But Burish and Burishova made it work. And it was just wonderful to watch. They became my personal and professional mentors. Anyway, I did a lot of work with Burishova. She gave me a lot of advice about life and everything else. And I had a wonderful time doing research there on interhemispheric transfer of memory, techniques for training, for using spreading depression to temporarily inactivate one hemisphere, training the animals so that whatever they learned would be restricted to the other hemisphere, then washing away the spreading depression, so to speak, clearing the brain, undeactivating, letting the brain go back to normal, and then seeing under what conditions does the information transfer to the other side. So how do you test if it transfers to the other side? You knock out the side you trained, right? So if you knock out the one side you trained, if you train one side with this side knocked out and you train half of the brain, and you can do that in a rat, right? Because you can restrict the input into one eye. And in the rat, most of the input is contralateral. So you can restrict the input to one side, knock out one side, train the other side, let them recover, knock out the trained side and just test the animal. It's as if they don't know anything. All right. However, when you let the brain recover with half of the brain trained, if you give them a few trials, 1 or 2 trials with the brain, both sides intact, you get a transfer of the information to the other side. So we did a bunch of experiments looking at the conditions under which you get that kind of transfer, basically. How many trials do you need? How often do you have to, whether the trials have to be correct trials or incorrect trials, and so on. We published a bunch of that. One of those papers ended up in Nature, which was like my second or third publication was a Nature publication, and I've never been published in Nature since, or Science. Again, I thought like this is the way it works, but it wasn't the way it works. Anyway, so I did that work, really loved it, and was living with my then wife and 2 little kids. The institute was in a town which was just on the outskirts of Prague. It's now inside Prague city limits, but it was just on the outskirts of Prague in the southwest a little bit. So it was a lovely place. It wasn't the city, but you could easily take a tram into the city, or, you were in town in 15 or 20 minutes. But it was a lovely place to live. And my kids had a great life in the rural part of it. Everything was hunky-dory until the Russians invaded. Then it got strange, right? So I was basically as it turns out, because of where we lived, the Russian tanks that had been flown into Hungary to make it appear as though it was a Warsaw Pact invasion rather than a Russian or German invasion. They had tanks coming up from the south. Those tanks rolled right past my house because we were on the southern route into the city with this little town. So I woke up in the morning of August 20th or 21st, 1968, and there were tanks coming up the road, Russian tanks, basically. And nobody thought it was going to happen, but it happened. So now what do you do? I've got 2 little kids. They were at that point in time, this was 68, they were 3.5 and 4.5. They spoke Czech fluently, better than English. And we really didn't know what to do, basically. But Burish and Burishova said, I cannot guarantee the safety of your children. You should probably leave. So we had a Volkswagen camper that we had bought in Germany. We loaded up everything we owned, and we drove out of what was then Czechoslovakia through tank columns to get out of the country. I suppose we should have felt in danger. I don't remember feeling in danger. We probably should have. Anyway, we got out, and then we were in Austria, got in touch with my parents, who you can imagine were, quite concerned, hadn't heard from us. In those days, there was no email, right? I mean, my parents and their first two grandkids, they had no idea whether they were safe or not. Anyway, and then what do? I said, well, there's only one person we know in Europe, John O'Keefe. So we called up John. I said, John, can we come and stay with you for a while? I may want to shift my research to London, if possible, for the time being. And John said, sure, come on. So drove across Europe and decamped on John O'Keefe's doorstep in an apartment, which, by the way, he still lives in. The same apartment.
Really? Okay.
1968. Right. So we showed up there and stayed there for a few weeks. And then I arranged to have my postdoc fellowship switched to University College London for 1 year in the psychology department, not in the anatomy department where John was. And I set up shop for some time in London for about 8 months. And then I went back to Prague to finish my postdoc when things settled. Things had settled down. I went back because I loved it there and so on. But during those 8 months in London, John and I decided it would be kind of cool if we were in the same department. And because we kind of got on well and we kind of respected each other's work, so to speak. I was not working on Hippocampus at this point, nor was he at that point yet. And so we cooked up an arrangement where I would go back to Prague, finish my postdoc, and then I would come to London as a lecturer in the anatomy department. I had a job set up for me, so to speak. That I would have a lab and all of that would be set up. So I went back to Prague, did a bunch more experiments with Olga Burashova, publishing in various places. And then the end of my postdoc, I went to London to take up a job at University College London in the anatomy department, on the same floor, 2 doors down from John. And at that point, no place cells, nothing yet. None of that had happened yet. That was just...
So that was what, like 1970?
This was 1970. This was the summer of 1970. Now, John was, I think, just beginning to work on Hippocampus then. But
72, the paper, right? Or something like that.
Paper came out in 71. The first place cell paper came out in 71. So at that point, I had split up with my wife, but I had my kids. They were living with me, and I was in another relationship, and I was in London. My initial thought in going to that lab in London, and what I set the lab up to do, was to investigate the neurophysiology behind the interhemispheric transfer stuff that I had studied in Prague. I was going to study the visual system and, crosstalk between hemispheres under the conditions that I had looked at behaviorally. That was my plan for what I was going to do in London. I was going to work on visual system and learning in visual cortex and so on. And I got my lab set up, and I had, some of the same issues that I had when I tried to be a chemist. I wasn't necessarily great at independently setting up a lab, but I'm tootling away, doing whatever I was doing. And John comes down the hall and says, yeah, have a look at some data that I just got. And he showed me the data from the first few place cells. And I had done my PhD on the hippocampus. We skipped over that, right? In an attempt to understand, the disjunct between animal and human results in hippocampal research in the 1960s. The animal models were failing and people didn't understand why. I had a hypothesis. My dissertation attempted to test that hypothesis. It didn't work. Doesn't matter. But I had done work on hippocampus, and John knew that. He came down and said, well, you've studied, you've been a hippocampal guy. What do you make of these cells? He didn't have to show me more than, 2 minutes of data. I said, wow, that looks like spatial stuff, doesn't it? And he said, absolutely. Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah. I mean, he knew it, and it was immediate. Right. And I'd say within about 10 nanoseconds, my interest in the visual system evaporated. and John said, well, we joined forces basically. And he continued the unit work. I did a lot of behavioral work, lesion work, and we started to write the book together. We started to develop the theory together. The basic idea, the hippocampus has these place cells. It's where Tolman's cognitive map must be, so to speak. And then we started to develop a theory, about what would this mean, if the hippocampus was that structure. And obviously it's also a memory structure. So that's interesting. And then how far can we take this idea, of the hippocampus as a cognitive map? I mean, that wasn't even, the book was just pipe dreams. There was no book idea yet. How can we take this notion that this is Tolman's cognitive map and use it to understand, all the stuff that's out there about the hippocampus, and use it to predict new things and to blah, 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 that kind of approach. And that's what led to the book. I mean, that's what led to initially to the development of the theory, the idea that the hippocampus was the core of a system that did cognitive mapping. And we initially, our concept at that point was we were going to write a kind of a fairly long psych review paper, which was the place where you published theoretical papers in the 1960s and 1970s if you were a psychologist. That was the only show in town. There were no frontiers journals. There was no, current opinion journals. None of that existed. If you had something to say theoretically, you published a paper in Psych Review, right? That was where Hull published his work. That was where Tolman, that was it. Okay, so that was our plan. We were writing up a kind of a chapter for a Psych Review paper. Now, of course, as you experienced, London is a place where a lot of famous people came to give talks. And one of the venues for these talks was the Neurology Institute, I guess it was then, headed by Elizabeth Warrington. Now, of course, Elizabeth Warrington was a major figure in memory research in the field. Warrington and Weisskranz. I mean, she was a major kind of opponent of Brenda Milner. So here was me and John kind of brought up in the Milner tradition. Now we were dealing with Elizabeth Warrington, very friendly, a great relationship with Elizabeth. And she had talks all the time in the Institute in Queen Square. You know where it is.
That's where I did my master's thesis, yeah.
That's where all the stuff happened, where Eleanor and all that sort of developed there. But at that point, Queen Square was just where Elizabeth Warrington was with her seminars. And we would go to the seminar in the building there. And then afterwards, we would go to Elizabeth's office in her one of those buildings on Queen Square. Same building, I think, essentially. And we would have Sherry in her office with the speaker, with a few selected guests. And John and I were amongst the selected guests. We were pretty tight with Elizabeth because she was interested in hippocampus. Well, the speaker this day was somebody, I'll tell you who it was in a minute if you care, but it was somebody whose name I didn't recognize. And he came in and he sat behind Elizabeth. He sat where Elizabeth normally sits, which set me off a little bit right away. And then he started to wax eloquent about what a liberated male he was. This was the period of female liberation in the U.S. And he was going on about, and his wife was also an academic, but I was a fairly intolerant person. I didn't put up with much bullshit in those days. Still don't. So after listening to this for a while and after having 2 or 3 sherries, I just lost it. And I just went after this guy and told him what an a-hole. I just went after him big time. And then said, "That's it. I can't stand being in your presence." And me and John looking at me horrified. And then the two of us left. And then we were walking down Queen Square. They have all these metal gates along Queen Square in front of the houses. We're walking down and John was holding on. And John said to me, "You know who that was, right?" And I said, "Yeah, some jerk, some jerk who thinks he's, God's gift to women," something like that. And he said, No. That's the editor of Psych Review. And I said, "Oh, I see." Well, that was the end of the plan to submit a paper to Psych Review. So then we stepped back and said, "Okay, what can we do instead?" So, well, why don't we write a monograph? We can write a small monograph and we get all our ideas into a monograph. And that's how the book got started, basically. We said we then launched into writing a more expanded version of the theory as a monograph. And the monograph just grew and grew and grew. And it went through a variety of versions, some of which we circulated to the broader public to get feedback on. And ultimately, that's what led to the book in 1978. But 6 years from when we first started thinking about writing a book to when the book came out.
Yeah, I read somewhere, this might have been actually on your Mastodon account. That, as you just mentioned, that it took like 6 years of getting the book actually finished. And sending it to colleagues for review and all that kind of stuff. I mean, was that planned from the beginning? I mean, I assume not that it took that long, but like, was it, or were the comments so critical that it took you lots of time to revise it, or were you just doing other stuff? Or
It's not so much that they were that critical, but I don't think when we started, we realized how much we were biting off. You know, I mean, in the end, I mean, we didn't have to write a book that, basically went into the philosophy, anatomy, physiology, behavior, neurology, neuropsych. We didn't have to do that. Not to mention going into the human case with language. And, there are substantial sections, but each one of those things took a lot of time, to actually write that philosophy. But at some point we decided, we want to tell the whole story. We don't just want to say why place cells are interesting and how they might make a cognitive map. We want to talk about why animals have cognitive maps in the first place. Why do they exist? Why do they exist? Why do they necessarily exist? What light do they shed on the way the bigger brain works, so to speak? We were somewhere along the way, we thought that, we had the potential to develop a theory that was sufficiently multi-level and anchored in enough literature separately, each of which constrain, what you can do within a theory, that thought we were developing a model for how the cognitive neuroscience of the brain ought to work. We were quite, I mean, I think it's immodest, I think, but we were conscious of the fact that we were developing a kind of a model for how this emerging cognitive neuroscience should go. That if you were going to talk about the function of the hippocampus, you had to talk about its anatomy and its physiology, and you had to do all of that if you wanted to have, and that was the way the field should develop. And we thought if we could crack the hippocampus and its structures, that could be the foundation for developing a kind of a cogneuro approach to the larger parts. And I think by and large that it had its impact in that way. So we didn't imagine it would take us 6 years when we got started, but we weren't surprised that it did once we kind of figured out what it is we wanted to do. Now, in the midst of all of that, I was going through all kinds of personal turmoil in my relationship life. So I probably could have gotten my parts done earlier. But John was, working away on the model. He was working away on the physiology. He was working away on the language stuff in humans because he had cared. So, we just kept moving the goalposts. I mean, it took that long because we kept on adding, let's weigh in on this as well. And let's add this bit and let's add that bit. I mean, we had no idea. But again, in those days, I remember distinctly a discussion with John coming down the stairwell of the anatomy department. If you've ever were in that lab, in John's lab up on the 5th floor of the anatomy building, and you walk down these very old creaky stairs, and I'm walking down the stairs, I can remember it as if it was yesterday. And I'm saying to John, John, it was 1973, 1974, something like that. I haven't published anything in 3 or 4 years, as in anything. After I had published a flurry of papers coming out of my Prague work, nothing. I said, John, should we be concerned that we're like, will we still have jobs? And John, at this point, John was the stronger of us. And he said, don't worry about it. It'll work out. Don't worry. Yeah. And the good news is we were in a department and we were at a time in the academic history when we were allowed to get away with that. We were not in a publish or perish regime. We were protected by Pat Wall, whose unit we were in. He said, you guys are working on something important. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about the fact that you're not publishing. The head of the department was J.Z. Young. J.Z. Young, very, very famous, the guy with the octopus work from the 1930s. Very, very famous neuroanatomist. You look him up, J.Z. Young. 6'7", incredibly imposing kind of guy. He protected us. So we were protected. We were allowed to take that time. We were allowed to develop our thinking. This, I say to students now, I don't know if this could happen now. I don't know under what conditions people would be allowed to do what we did, to develop our ideas, not worry about publishing. not worry so much about getting grants, although we had grants to do research and so on, and just go for it intellectually. I mean, that was a rare and lucky event, basically, that we were where we were. I mean, I go back to the theme of how lucky I was, right? To be down the hall when John, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, would an approach today to do something like that be to instead publish, each chapter as a separate paper, and that way is that the only way you can do it, or?
Almost certainly. I mean, on the other hand, every so often people are publishing books. Some people are still taking that route. I don't know of another example quite like the Cognitive Map book, but there are people who are still doing it. Again, I think that was in that era you could do that. We got away with it. We were lucky. It worked out well, but conditions now would make it much harder for us to do what we did then. But so we took our time. In the meantime, I actually left London in 76 to move back to the States. Again, personal issues. And I continued working in the States on the book, on the sections of the book, the human sections of the book that I was working on, and all the behavioral stuff, all the chapters on behavior. And John was continuing to work on the model, and we were in constant contact.
I started this last episode, but I want to have a few recurring questions that I ask every guest at the end of the episode. The first one is, what's a kind of paper or book that basically you think more people should read? Maybe it's something that used to be famous, people forgot about it. Maybe it was never actually read widely, but should be. Do you have anything there?
I mean, there's a couple. I thought about that a little. There are a couple that I keep telling people. Have you read? Did you ever read this paper? So I'll tell you the two that come to mind. One of them is by Stan Klein. It was about episodic memory and sort of, why do we remember the episodic memories we do remember? Episodic memory is this special zone, and it's quite clear that we don't remember all of our episodes. We only remember a small number of them. Why do we remember the ones we remember? Well, a lot of people think of salience and whatever, but there's a lot of answers to that question. Anyway, Klein wrote a paper, I think it was in 2001, maybe in 2002, and it was in Psych Review. And the idea that he put forward in that paper was that we remember the exception cases. That for episodes that are kind of like other episodes in our life, we end up with a kind of a schematic, kind of semantic-like memory for all of those episodes mushed together because they were all so similar. But if you have an episode that starts out like one of those, but ends up being rather unique and quite different, that one you remember because that's an exception case, and there might be something about that you need to know. You don't want that just to be mixed in with the statistics of all the others. So this is when you're not doing statistical learning about everything in the world, why do you keep a singular memory of a single thing that you don't subject to the statistics? Stan Klein had a view about that. And they wrote a paper on it. I think that was an important paper that people should pay attention to. Mm-hmm. Round about the same time, Peter Holly and Diane, I can't remember the first name of the colleague person, were working on sort of this question of if the hippocampus and the cortex are kind of talking to each other all the time, and as a function of consolidation, and if the memories and if cortex, according to the 1995 complementary learning systems model, McClellan, McNaughton, and O'Reilly model, cortex is slowly being changed over time to accommodate new information. That means that if the hippocampus is connected to a particular set of nodes in the cortex, and the cortex is slowly evolving, how does the hippocampal index to that cortical stuff stay in register with the cortical neurons if they are slowly changing? If the cortical engram is slowly changing, how does the hippocampus stay in register with it? So they identified that as a problem for how. Anyway, this came out of a paper, I think, in 2002 for Colley and Diane. That's a paper I recommend to everybody to read, but very few people are aware of it because that is a crucial problem. It's even more important now that we know that there's this representational drift in the hippocampus. So you got hippocampal representations that are drifting around. You got cortical representations that are drifting around. But everybody's theory requires that the hippocampus and the cortex be able to talk to each other in a meaningful way. How do they do that if they're both drifting? Anyway, that's a computational problem, and that paper is the first one that I'm aware of that identified that. One more, Rao and Ballard. the first paper that really put the predictive model, on everybody's radar screen. Another paper that people should really pay attention to, and give credit to. So that's a longish answer to
Yeah.
maybe.
Something that you wish you'd learned sooner. This can be from academia, from your private life, basically whatever. Some sort of error that you've repeated too often, and maybe one or two times too often. Yeah.
That's a tough one for me, it turns out. Because probably should say, I learned not to take myself too seriously, but I don't think I've ever taken myself too seriously. But I think I've learned what little seriousness I did invest in myself. I've learned was probably not such a good idea. So that would be one thing. That's more of a personal thing. My career thing, I guess I've learned that I've had such an unusual career. Measured and been so lucky in so many ways that I've learned not to use my experience to give advice to others.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that, and I don't mean that sort of, in a bragging way that they couldn't replicate what I can do. That's not the point at all. But just that the combination of things that got me to where I am is so unusual and so lucky that you can't count on that. So here's the one. I'll give you one example, then we'll move on to something else. When I became department head, I was having to deal with people who were going up for tenure, and the anxiety and the difficulties and what it's like to be in that situation under that pressure. I never did that. I was on soft money until I got hired at Arizona, when I was hired as a full professor with tenure. I never went through the tenure angst. I never had that experience. So when I was dealing with my faculty members, young colleagues who were, going on about how hard this was, and inside I never felt what they felt, so I didn't say, oh no, I learned to stop saying, don't worry about it, not that big a deal, blah blah blah, because it wasn't from me, and I learned to not, and that's just an example for how I learned, my experience is. I shouldn't imagine, that I can give good advice to others to do it like I did it, because that probably isn't such good advice in the end.
Yeah. Like the step one is miraculously be part of a golden generation.
Right, exactly.
With one of the most influential psychologists. Yeah.
Find yourself in, as a graduate student in a place with a future Nobel Prize winner and a bunch of people who are the most famous people on the planet. That's step one. Go from there.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So I guess my last question of what you would recommend to someone maybe like me, a younger researcher in the PhD or early postdoc. So did you just answer that by saying you're not going to do that?
No, that I could do, because I think in terms of the ideas about what would be interesting to work on, that's a different.
Yeah.
It's not like don't do it my way. And I think quite honestly right now that I think this, first of all, the shift to the kind of predictive model of the brain and how that works. To me, that's where the action is now. The Bayesian approach, all this business about having priors. How does the brain do that? And I think in particular, memory research again has gotten quite exciting, because people are really pushing on dynamical models of memory. So I would say to people who are just getting started, first of all, and I asked this question of Brenda Milner, and her answer to this question was learn all the new techniques. So I think the first thing is you got to familiarize yourself with the new technologies and what can be done. You don't have to be an expert at them, because nobody can be, but you have to be aware of what are the possibilities. What kinds of questions can actually be approached empirically now? The kinds of questions that we were talking about with Konorski back in the 1960s about, we want to know why these neurons, but not that, but not those neurons, show learning. We all said at that point, we can't ask those kind of questions empirically now. Now we can, right? So understand what's possible technically. And then what are the big questions in the field? Think about big questions. It's great to get caught up in answering a specific question, but what's the big question you're interested in? Have such a big question in your mind, even if you're working on a small thing. For me, the big question is just, how do memories get modified continuously? What's the dynamical way in which prediction error and all of that interacts in a way to so that our memories are constantly being updated so that they're more adaptive. That's, to me, exciting. And I would recommend that to anyone who was looking for a specific question to be excited about. But there's a lot of other ones. I mean, the field there's really a lot of good stuff out there now. And the techniques that are available make it possible to do some pretty fascinating experiments. But here's the big but. But you must pay attention to the behavior of the animal you're studying. Don't get stuck using super cool technology on Stone Age behavioral paradigms, because then you'll end up saying really stupid stuff. Your understanding of the behavior and the role of that behavior in the ecological niche of that animal is as important as your understanding of the technology you're using, which looks really fancy. And I'll close on, this is why O'Keefe discovered place cells. He had trained with a behaviorist. He had trained with an ethologist, Danny Lerman. He had worked in a lab where the importance of paying attention to the ecologically important aspects of an animal's behavior was drilled into him even before he became a graduate student. As a graduate student, he spent his time trying to develop ways to record from single cells in the amygdala of a freely moving animal. That was what he did his work on in graduate school. He was ready to start working on freely moving rats in Hippocampus, and he was aware of the importance of doing it in a way that the animal could move around in the world. So he had to solve the problem of movement artifact. Once he solved the problem of movement artifact with field effect transmitters on the animal's head, which is what he did in the early work. I mean, all of this preceded tetrodes and all that kind of thing. Once he solved that problem and the animals could move around in the world, voila, place cells were obvious. So the lesson here for the students is be as sophisticated about your understanding of behavior and about the ecological aspects of that behavior for the animal you're studying as you are about technology. And then bring big questions to that knowledge, and guess what? You'll do well. That would be my advice.